Hey, it's Joe Zarzaur and Dr. Malone again for another installment of Zarzaur Law TV. We're here today to talk about a very important subject, and that is the diversity and the diversification of a hospital these days. For instance, if you are admitted through the ER like many of my clients are, you will come in contact with different specialties during your stay. And each specialty has their own obligation to report what they find, and then hopefully it becomes part of the electronic medical record. And then the other specialties that are working alongside the consulting specialist have an obligation to follow you throughout the hospitalization and make sure that everybody's talking to each other. I wanted Dr. Malone to describe a little bit the current status in 2015 of how a hospitalization is diversified by caregiver, I guess, starting in the emergency room. I know it's complicated. I know that we want to keep this sort of short, but if you could just give us a brief sketch of that.
Sure. Many times nowadays, if you have a primary care provider or any other doctor who's caring for you outside the hospital, meaning you see them on a routine basis, the moment you come to the hospital, it's almost like hit the reset button. They may not be involved in your care. So saying, oh, you need to check with Dr. So-and-so and all that stuff, that doesn't carry a lot of weight. So focusing on who the players are in the hospital, who your care team is should be number one. If that applies to your outpatient doctor in some way because there's some overlap, great, good for you in fact. Many times that's not the case. Anyhow, we'll divide it into what I'll call 3 areas. Number 1 is the ER, number 2 is your inpatient care, number 3 is planning for discharge. Does it involve your primary care doctor or some of these doctors you met in the hospital? In the ER, you're going to meet an emergency room physician and or one of their mid-level providers, a nurse practitioner, a physician's assistant. The role of those folks is to deal with any acute abnormality that is going to injure you immediately, that you may be suffering from, to stabilize you and get you to the next point, whether it requires transfer to another hospital, whether it requires calling in a specialist of some sort emergently to deal with whatever the issue may be, or say, hey, you're sick, we don't know what's wrong with you, you do need to be admitted, there's more treatment, more testing that needs done. That, in my mind, is the role of the ER folks. After that comes what I would call the admitting doctor or the attending doctor.
ER doctors don't admit.
ER doctors do not admit. In fact, many hospitals in the country, ER doctors don't have admitting privileges. So
they can't admit.
Exactly. Some of them have privileges enough to just write the order, admit to the hospital, but they don't have privileges enough to write a whole set of admission orders that's going to follow you throughout the hospital.
And the basis for that is what?
Because the ER provider is not going to be the one to see you the next day or 12 hours later, or whatever the frequency needs to be depending on your illness. So you need someone to then take over your care. So the ER doctor may be handing a patient over who's still critically ill, though stable, to another provider, and the ER doctor then at that point is for the most part done, except for maybe their own curiosity of, oh, I wonder how that case ended up. I'm going to check the chart on my own.
Is the admitting doctor usually a specialist, or is that the hospitalist, or how does that work?
The trend nowadays is that a hospitalist, which many times is an internal medicine physician, there are some family practitioners filling that role, generally is the admitting physician or attending physician.
And that's what you did for 5 or 6 years before.
Correct.
You... Okay.
Correct. And the reason why that is the case is these physicians are trained in a broad scope of medicine where they've seen they've been trained in most subspecialties to a certain extent. They've just not specialized in one of them. So that when they say, oh, there's a cardiac problem, I need to get a cardiologist involved. And they can communicate with said physician intelligibly and then take care of the patient as a whole while dealing with that consultant. So anyhow, the attending physician, admitting physician, many times nowadays is a hospitalist who, again, is not your primary care doctor. You have never even met this physician, hopefully, up to this point. And then that hospitalist can and sometimes will speak with your primary care provider and say, hey, just admitted Mr. So-and-so, he's here for this. Is there anything that you can lend me for insight to try and improve this patient's care? That doesn't always happen, though, for a litany of reasons. Along with that attending physician comes consultants in the hospital. And this is still a little bit muddy. Is a consultant someone who's asked for one opinion about one little part of your body, or is it asked someone who's to co-manage your care as a whole? So that's still a little bit muddy depending, again, on the illness at hand, all the other particulars of the patient. And with all of these physicians, the complicating factor is they will also sometimes have mid-levels with them, nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, and these physicians will sometimes take shifts. Oh, I'm the cardiologist working on Monday. Oh, I'm the cardiologist working on Tuesday. So that's where it gets real confusing. So understanding who these different folks are, like there's an admitting doctor, there's a cardiologist on board, there's an oncologist on board, whatever the case may be, just make sure that you have a way to track that, and even ask them when they come in, which doctor are you, who do you represent? Things like that are what I would think would be good cues to you, as well as any family members in the room.
But when you have that many different providers, mid-level, senior level, whatever, it's really important that the records are kept well, because the cardiologist that comes on Tuesday may not be the same cardiologist that comes on Wednesday or Thursday, but their information is only as good as what the person wrote on Tuesday, right?
Exactly, and that, I think, is a flaw of the system. And there's probably some physicians who, unbeknownst to them, are not getting a diagnosis, they're missing some test results, whatever, because, oh, my partner ordered it and he or she must have followed up on it, it's okay. We can send the patient home or whatever. So that's where I think it's risky being in the hospital, being a patient in the hospital, where there is this fragmented or fractured care, where there's no cohesiveness between the different testing, who ordered it, I didn't order it, so it's not my job to follow it up. Well, it's your patient, though, too.
Right. And the hospitalist stays on board all through the hospitalization until discharge?
Yeah, and that's the role of the admitting or the attending physician, such as the hospitalist, should be to provide some level of continuity amongst all these other variables, so that they say, oh, this test that one of the specialists ordered came back, and there's an abnormality. Maybe I ought to touch base back with the specialist and say, is there something we need to do about this, or whatever. So you would hope that you have an advocate on your side in the form of a hospitalist, kind of quarterbacking the whole situation.
All right. So all in all, it's complicated. It sounds like a government situation, even though it's not. But as a patient, you've got to be on your toes, and as a patient's family, you've got to be on your toes, making sure that these communications are happening between doctors. And if they report to you some abnormality as a cardiologist, you need to make sure the next cardiologist that comes in has that report and they have that information, because otherwise you're going to be set back a couple of days. And sometimes hours are critical, minutes are critical. So it's very important that as a patient and a patient's family that you take notes, that you are aware, that you pass this information on. Don't assume that the hospitalist is doing it. Don't assume the cardiologists are doing it. Don't assume anybody's doing anything. You do it. So if we can help you in any respect, obviously there's malpractice cases that come out of these doctors not communicating with one another, or these doctors not running the right test. So if the firm can help you in analyzing one of those fact situations, hopefully that's not the case, we're happy to do so. You can find us on the web at zarzaurlaw.com or at 855-HIRE-JOE. If you have a scenario, you just need some medical feedback, you can get in touch with the firm. We can try to get you that information through Dr. Malone. Anyway, that's the way to get in touch with us.